Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for research methods. In this lecture, we're going to talk about research strategies and validity. I know we've already talked about validity, but now we're going to look at validity kind of in a way when it applies directly to the research. So looking at this, it might look pretty long here because we've got 9 learning objectives, but it is a relatively short lecture that we're going to get through. Well, let's get right into it. First, we're going to talk about research strategies as an overview, because these are the types of research strategies that we're going to look at basically throughout the rest of the semester, but now we're going to do an overview of them. So the first learning objective there is to identify the determinants of research strategy selection. What determines what strategy you select? The second learning objective is explain the 3 research claims and how they affect research strategy selection. So we're going to look at those 3 claims. Those 3 claims being, first one, frequency. So learning objective 3 is describe the purpose of the frequency claim. Association, describe the purpose of the correlation claim. And causal, describe the purpose of the causal claim. And then we're going to talk about validity again, as I said, this is kind of different. This is actually different types of validity that we already didn't cover. So we already covered basically the basics of validity and what we're looking at when we're looking at like construct validity. Now we're going to look at compare and contrast the 4 types of validity that are used to evaluate the frequency, association, and causal claims that we just talked about there. Then we're going to look at the external validity, which is analyze the external validity as it pertains to the research claims. Statistical validity, analyze the statistical validity as it pertains to the research claims. And finally, internal validity. And the learning objective there is to analyze the internal validity as it pertains to the research claims. So getting right into our first learning objective here. And our first learning objective here is to identify the determinants of research strategy selection. So what determines what research strategy we select? Well, if the general approach and goals of a research study is to determine something, then our selection of our research strategy is going to then be determined by, first, the kind of question you plan to address. So what kind of question do you plan to address? Do you plan to address something causal? Do you plan to just see if things are related? Do you want to check something major, something minor, something like that? So the kind of question you plan to address determines which research strategy you're going to choose. How about if any variables can be manipulated? This one's actually pretty important here. If we can manipulate variables. We're going to talk in just a minute about true experiments, and we're going to get to that later in the semester too. But true experiments are ideally what we want to do as far as researching when we're doing research, because true experiments, you can actually do a causal claim. However, sometimes variables can't be manipulated. Can you manipulate so to do a causal experiment, you have to manipulate who is in what group. If you're looking at to see if one drug is better than another drug to relieve pain, you can manipulate that. You can put some participants in one group, they get one drug, some participants in another group, they get another drug. Very related to that though, if let's say you've got a treatment for a disease and you're trying to see how effective that treatment is versus just in general. You can't assign people to get that treatment and other people to get a placebo. Some people would have to get that treatment. Some people would have to get another treatment that's already known to be effective. That's one way where the variable can be manipulated, but you have to be ethical about it. You can't fully manipulate it like you want. How about you want to see if pregnancy affects women's cognitive abilities, something crazy like that. Can you manipulate who gets pregnant? No. So because you cannot manipulate that variable, there's ethical concerns there. Theoretically, you could manipulate it, but it's very unethical to manipulate it. But because there's ethical concerns, it's not something you can manipulate. It does determine what strategies you can choose. The availability of study participants. If you're doing research on children with autism, it might be much more difficult to get study participants. If you're doing research on some rare disease, it's difficult to get participants. If you're just doing research that can be studied with college students, then it becomes much easier because you can just have intro psych students take a survey. And the last one that's always of import is cost. Some experiments are much easier and cheaper to do than others. If you have the funding, you might want to do the more complex one. If you don't have the funding, then you might just be stuck with whatever it is you can do. So let's get right into that second learning objective, which is explain the research claims and how they affect the research strategy selection. So we just looked at some of the things that affect research strategy selection, but now we're going to look at the big one, and that is our research claims, what it is we're looking at. The first of these claims is the frequency claim. And a frequency claim is basically when you're examining individual variables. It could be also called descriptive. So when we talk about descriptive statistics, we're looking a lot at frequency claims. Now, yes, you can do more with frequency claims than just descriptive statistics. You can start to make inferences from them. But we're mainly looking at here like descriptives. So some frequency claims we see over here. 1 in 25 U.S. teens attempt suicide. That's a descriptive for one variable. 79% of think that regifting is acceptable. Again, one variable, an individual variable, and that's describing the variable. Now maybe they used inferential statistics to put it at the 79%, but it's still a descriptive statistic. More than 2/3 of college women use vocal fry sounds. So again, one variable, an individual variable. This is just a frequency claim, how often something occurs. We can still make generalizations about the population from it, but again, it's just a frequency of one variable. The next is association claims, often called, and you'll hear it way more often, as correlation, correlational claims. So this is when you're looking at the relationship between variables. It might be between two variables, it might be between three variables. Either way, it might be between more. Either way, it's the relationships between variables. So it is the correlational claim or the association claim. Fit kids do better at math and reading. Bedroom TVs may boost kids' risk of fat and disease. So these are association claims. You have two different variables and you're looking at the relationship or the association or the correlation between those two different variables. And the final one, which is the one we want to do whenever we can, and this is strategies that examine causal relationships between two variables. So we're still looking at between variables. It's still that between variables, the same thing we looked at with correlational. However, with correlational, we're just looking to see if a relationship exists. We're not trying to find cause. With a causal claim, we are trying to find cause. So this is where we'll have experimental research design or quasi-experimental. So looking at the research designs, frequency claims use descriptive research designs, association claims use correlational research designs, and causal claims will use experimental and sometimes quasi-experimental research designs. Experimental is more controlled, but quasi-experimental still can fall into this. Here we are on slide 5, and we already have our third learning objective. So this is describe the purpose of a frequency claim. So I already talked about this a little bit, but again, a frequency claim is going to be when you have an individual variable and you're going to then describe that variable. So it's a description of individual variables as they exist within a specific group, and they are not a comparison by themselves. You can sometimes, with a frequency claim, make comparisons between different groups on the same variable. And in stats, that's something you look at when you look at things like two-sample tests, where you've got different individuals' response to the same variable. So frequencies for the same variable. So how do we obtain the data here? It can be surveys. So when you give surveys, interviews, behavioralistic, naturalistic, so observational. All of these are things where you can get a descriptive or a description of an individual variable. You can even have true experiments where within the experiment you are measuring a behavior or a behavioral variable, and that variable becomes a descriptive or a frequency. Examples here. On average, local college students study 12.5 hours outside of class each week and get 7.2 hours of sleep each night. That is the dream. As a professor, that is the dream. The students would study 12 and a half hours and get 7.2 hours of sleep. The actual numbers are probably much lower than that on both of those. Fourth learning objective, describe the purpose of a correlational claim. I already said this. Correlational claims or our association claims is where we're looking at the relationship between two variables when we're trying to see if change on one variable is accompanied by change on another variable, but we are not looking to explain cause. We are not trying to explain cause. So we're not trying to say that one variable causes another. We're just trying to see if there is a relationship between those two variables. Typically, when we have ethical concerns about assigning to groups, we have to do a correlational analysis rather than a causal analysis, unless we can do a quasi-experimental research design, and then we can get closer to cause. So in this, two variables for each individual in the group are being studied. We're trying to see if there's a relationship between the two. So like we're trying to see if there's a relationship between wake up time and GPA. We do know that there's a relationship between wake up time and GPA for college students. We don't know if one's causing the other. We don't know if wake up time is causing a decrease in GPA scores. Later waking up later causes a decrease in GPA scores. It could be a lower GPA scores cause students to wake up later. Or it could be a third factor, which is likely it, and that is motivation. Motivation could affect both of these. Motivation could be driving both of these. So when we're talking about that, we've got different types of relationships between variables. And again, in stats, we talk about this, but looking at it from the methods perspective, you can have different types of relationships. You can have linear relationships, which is where you're testing things like Pearson's R, the correlation coefficient. But you can have curvilinear relationships as well. Can't discount curvilinear relationships, like what we see down here. So in B and C, we see they're direct linear relationships. But in D, we see it's a curvilinear relationship. As x goes up, y goes up, but as x goes up farther, y goes up faster. We can have both positive and negative relationships, as we see in B, as x goes up, y goes up, or in C, as x goes up, y goes down. So a positive relationship and a negative relationship. You can have it with interval and ratio variables, which most of B, C, and D are going to be an interval and ratio. Or you can have it with ordinal or nominal variables. Waking up early or waking up late would be an ordinal variable. We don't have specific times. So A would be an ordinal level variable. You can do correlational analysis, nominal variables. You just have to be careful with how you analyze it, because nominal variables, they don't have above and below. So if you've got two levels of a nominal variable, you can do it. If you have more than two levels, you have to actually get into some dummy coding and stuff like that. Things you'll get into in higher order regression. You can get into some dummy coding and look at how you would do correlation with a nominal variable that has more than 2 levels. At 2 levels, you can just put them side by side, and then it doesn't matter which one's higher than the other. You just have to be aware that the positive or negative correlation that you find is only due to the order you put them in, that them having a relationship doesn't necessarily mean it's positive or negative in correlational analysis. As always have to repeat this. Correlation does not imply causation. Just because two things like social status and health are correlated does not mean social status is causing an increase in health, or an increase in health is causing an increase in social status. It's likely some third factor is causing or affecting an increase in both of those, like your family, the how you're raised, that type of thing. Self-esteem and academic achievement, the same thing. There is a correlation between them, but is self-esteem causing academic achievement? Is academic achievement causing higher self-esteem? Or is it something else that's causing both? A study was conducted in Taiwan that sought to identify which factors predicted the adoption of birth control methods. So what factors predicted it? They did a correlational analysis because they're just doing a survey. The variable that showed the highest correlation with use of birth control was number of appliances in the house. So there's a high correlation in Taiwan between number of appliances and use of birth control. Does that mean having more appliances means you're going to use birth control more? No. This is an obvious case of some third factors causing both of those, and it's likely wealth. Having money would mean you'd have more appliances in the house, means you'd be more and also at the same time be more likely to use birth control. So again, correlation doesn't imply causation, and you really have to, anytime you do a correlational analysis, even if you understand the relationship, you have to look at that. Later in the semester, we'll look at this, and we'll look at the things that go into correlation, and there is times where we can start to imply causation from correlation. But there's need of specific conditions to be met to start doing that, and we can only do it statistically if those conditions are met. But we'll come back to that later. And it's one of the reasons why in the next one, we're about to get to causal in just a second. It's one of the reasons why in causal we will talk about how cause works and how we can do causal. Well, those conditions are automatically met in a causal research study. They're met by default in a causal research study that's done if it's designed correctly. A correlational, you have to meet those conditions outside of the research design in order to be able to start to imply causation from a correlation. Which gets us to our fifth learning objective. We're already to 5 of 9, pretty quick there. So this is to describe the purpose of those causal claims I was talking about. And the purpose, it's a cause and effect explanation for the relationship between two or more variables where a change in one variable causes that change in another variable. And as I said, we've got those requirements. Let's even look at those requirements now. So first, you have to demonstrate an association between variables A and B. You do have to have covariance. You do have to have a relationship between them. So when you've got a correlation, you've got this condition met. The condition is of association between the variables is met, but the other conditions aren't met in a correlational. The next is temporal precedence. So first is covariance. These are these three. I recommend knowing these three just because it makes for a very easy question on an exam. All of what is the conditions required for causal? Covariance is one. Temporal precedence is another. What does temporal precedence mean? Temporal precedence means that variable A precedes variable B. So if I am studying, let's say, do video games cause violence or cause aggression? And I, in the experiment, have people play video games first, and then the aggression comes second, then I've proven temporal precedence. And let's say let's use this example all the way through. The first one is association. We first have to demonstrate that there's a relationship or an association or correlation between playing video games and aggression. So we in our study we find that yet we statistically analyze it. We find that though that is a relationship. More video game use is correlated with more aggression. By the way, I'm saying straight up right now, if I haven't already talked about it in this class, this is one thing that has been found repeatedly, and even my lab when I was a grad student found this. There is a relationship between playing violent video games and aggression. However, it is a very transient association, a very short association. The increase in aggression that comes from playing violent video games lasts about 10 minutes is all. It doesn't, at most it lasts 30 minutes. So all of it where they say that people are going and shooting up schools because they play violent video games, that's impossible, because the increase in aggression only lasts for about 10 to 30 minutes at most. So someone would have had to have been playing the violent video game as they were driving to school, as they were in the school, and then doing it. So it's really there isn't a direct cause there for long term. There is a cause for short term. So again, going back to this, demonstrating that association. So if you run your experiment, you give half the people have them a violent video game, half of them playing a non-violent video game that still gets their arousal up. You've got to really control for that. That's important. You can't have one person playing a puzzle game and one person playing GTA and then expect there to be similar physiological arousal. No, you need somebody playing GTA and somebody else playing a game that gets them doing something, but there's no violence in it. Maybe a racing game, that type of thing. Okay, so experiments done finds that those who were playing the violent video game over the racing game were more aggressive in the aggression task afterwards. Let's say we were measuring how many drops of hot sauce they put in a drink for the next person to drink, that type of thing. That's a measure of aggression. So covariance has been identified. Precedence has been, or temporal precedence has been identified, because playing the video game preceded the violence, the aggression. And then the final one is no other variables can account for the association. This is internal validity. We'll talk about internal validity later on in these slides, but this is the important one. This is the one that correlational analyses lacks. Now, it's possible that correlational analyses lacks the temporal precedence. But that's easier to prove with the correlational. You can still prove temporal precedence. You can still prove that one thing occurred before another. But you can't count out other variables or control. This is what's referred to as control. You can't control for other variables in a correlational analysis. You can in an experimental by controlling all of the conditions and making sure that people that are in each of the conditions are going through everything the same, everything except the experimental variable. So one group's playing a GTA and one group's playing a racing game. Make sure they're in the same rooms. Make sure that the lighting is the same, because it could be the lighting is what's causing it. That's a really interesting thing. Those who do things in lower lighting tend to have more frustration and as a result may act more aggressively. So you have to have the lighting the same, you have to have the time of the day the same, you have to have people randomly assigned to the two conditions. This is something else we'll talk about later. They have to be randomly assigned to the two conditions to make sure that the two groups are roughly equal. They're not going to be exactly identical, but you want to make sure they're roughly equal by random assignment. So what we're looking at here is that changing the level of one variable creates two or more treatment conditions, then measuring the second variable for participants in each condition. An example here, increasing the amount of exercises causes a decrease in cholesterol levels. You have two groups of people, and you randomly assign them to the two groups. One group you assign to exercise, the other you assign to not exercise, and you check their cholesterol. If the cholesterol is lower in those that exercised afterwards, then you can say you've got a causal claim because you basically demonstrated that the variables are associated. A preceded B, the exercise preceded the decrease in cholesterol, and no other variables accounted for it. You did this by random assignment. Now we can't fully control for everything, but hopefully through random assignment we can control for most things. Which does get us to quasi-experimental design. Quasi-experimental design is a type of design that still attempts to produce the cause and effects explanation when a variable cannot be manipulated. It does fall short of true causal research. This is important. Quasi-experimental is not true causal. It's a step closer than correlational. In a lot of correlational research that they want to find a cause and effect causal, they'll design it as a quasi-experimental. But we do quasi-experimental when we can't manipulate the treatment condition. Again, let's say we've got, we want to see if pregnancy affects cognition. We can't manipulate the independent variable. So we can't randomly assign people to the treatment and the control condition. We can't randomly assign people to be pregnant or not pregnant. Because of that, because we're not random assigning, we can't fully account for all other variables. So we can still do association between the variables. We can still get covariance. We can still do temporal precedent, but we can't fully account for all other variables. What'll happen is quasi-experimental designs will attempt to control for everything that they possibly can and treat it as a causal with the limitations of not being able to control for all factors. Still measures before and after scores for a group. And for a group that receives a treatment, a group that doesn't receive a treatment, but you can't assign people to groups. So the treatment may cause a reduction in smoking behavior, but the reduction in smoking behavior may be caused by something else. What do I mean? If I've got two groups and so you find one group where they attempt to quit smoking. One group's attempting to quit smoking, the other group is not. You can't assign people to quit smoking or not, because smoking is known to be harmful, so you can't automatically tell people, no, you can't quit smoking. So because of that, we just find a group that's quitting and a group that's not quitting, and we check that. It could be that or in this case, we're talking about reduction in smoking behavior, whatever it is we're doing, but let's say we were trying to see the effects of that on health. Well, then in that case, it could be that the effects on health weren't due to the reduction in smoking. It was actually due to something pertaining to the groups that were willing to quit smoking. That kind of thing. Let's look at some examples of some data here. I'm looking at this because it allows us to look at what we can do. Let's say we were looking at the exercise versus low exercise versus high exercise, and smoking behavior versus non-smoking behavior. So this is quitting behavior. So you're trying to see if a educational program it will cause people to quit, something like that, or a drug. The experimental one is where you can tell people, one group, don't exercise. One group, exercise. Then compare cholesterol levels after. But on the other hand, we can't assign people to these groups. We just look at people who are doing different programs, let's say, different quitting programs. Like one group isn't doing any program at all, and one group has decided to do Nicorette gum. And you see smoking behaviors after a certain amount of time for these two groups. This gets us to the second half of the slides. Already we're in the second half of the slides, and we're with learning objective 6, compare and contrast the 4 types of validities that are used to evaluate those claims, the frequency, association, and causal claims. So these 4 types of validities we're going to look at are going to basically be how we interrogate, investigate, evaluate, however you want to say it, these claims. And these 4 validities that should be evaluated are construct validity, which we've already covered. So I'm not going to go over that more. Except maybe just very briefly, but it's not something that we're going to look at as one of the major things here because we've already talked about it. We talked about it before in the reliability and validity chapter and looked at how a construct validity is how well the variables are measured or manipulated, the extent to which the operational variables used in a study are a good approximation of the conceptual variables. So again, the construct validity is important. It's very important because it determines how valid the study is as a whole. But then these other validities that are important, these other three that we are going to go into more. The first is external validity. So external validity, and we'll look at this more in the coming slides, but it's going to be the extent to which the results of a study generalize to a larger population. External validity is going to be also called generalizability. And so it's looking at how we can generalize from our participants to the population as a whole. And we'll look at things within that and how that is measured and what is important for that. The next is statistical validity. Statistical validity is the strength of the stats, strength of how strong the stats are. We'll look at things like probability. We'll look at effect size. So that's something coming up in stats is effect size, looking at things like that. The extent to which a study minimizes the probability of two specific errors, concluding that there's an effect when there's not, a false positive or a type 1 error, and concluding that there is no effect when there is a miss or a type 2 error. Again, something talked about more in stats. We'll talk about this very briefly in here, but that's more covered in stats. And then final validity is internal validity. In a relationship between one variable and another, the extent to which A rather than some other variable is responsible for the effect. So when you've got that relationship between two, higher internal validity is when you can account for all of the other variables. External validity is generalizability. Statistical validity is how good are your stats. Internal validity is how good your control is. Now we're going to look at each of these individually, but that's the main things. We're talking about the generalizability, the strength of stats, and control. Looking at the first one, external validity, and this is learning objective 7, analyze external validity as it pertains to the research claims. So external validity, also called, like I said, generalizability, is looking at the extent to which the results of a study can be generalized to a larger or even a different population. And one major threat to external validity is any characteristic of a study that limits the ability to generalize a study's results. Let's say you are trying to find a relationship between anxiety and depression, and you study it on college students. Well, a threat to external validity here is a characteristic of the study that eliminates the ability or limits the ability to generalize, which would be the age of the participants. Most college students are going to be within a specific age range, so that is a limiting factor. Another limiting factor is it's on college students, so it's only those of a sufficient education level. So you can't generalize it to people of different education levels. So that's issues. So different kinds of generalizations. You can have a generalization from a sample to a general population, like I was just saying. You're generalizing from a sample that you did in a study to the general population as a whole. But there are actually other types of generalizations that occur that are threats to external validity. Generalizing from one research study to another. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're looking at how participants respond on one research study and you're trying to say on another study they'll respond the same way, that's a generalization. Generalization from a research study to a real-world situation. if I put you in an artificial lab situation, are you going to respond the same in a real world situation? We need lab situations to have full control, but by doing that, we reduce our ability to fully generalize. We harm or limit our generalization. We still will generalize to a real world situation, but it's still limited. We still need to take into account that that is a limitation. And finally, generalizing from one population to another, including cross species. If I do a study on Americans, can I generalize my results to all humans? Can I generalize my results to other species? So that is something that needs to be taken into consideration. And I'm not giving specific yes or no's here on what's going on, whether a specific thing is generalizable. I'm just saying these are the questions that need to be asked to answer external validity. So let's look at an example. Imagine a researcher asks all of their Facebook friends how happy they are. 100 friends respond and 56 say they are happy and 44 say they're not. Can you see any problems with external validity here? Well, first off, before anything else, let's just ask the question. Should the researcher say that 44% of Americans are unhappy? No. Should they even say that 44% of their friends are unhappy? The answer there is also no. A very big no on both of those. Why not? Because there are so many other variables that limit the external validity. First off, we'll look at, Americans. So he only asked his friends. So it could just be his friends are happier than normal. It could be his friends are more unhappy than normal. The point is that he could, as a product of him individually, he could choose people that are either happier or more unhappy, and as a result, you can't generalize to the entire population because of that. But can he even say his friends, 44% of his friends are unhappy? No. All he can say is 44% of the people who responded are unhappy. It could be that he has 1,000 friends and that friends that are more happy are more likely to respond. Friends that are more unhappy are less likely to respond, and it could be like 900 of his friends are unhappy, but only 44 of them responded, but 56 of the 100 that are happy responded because people that are happy are more likely to respond to things like this. This is a known thing in psychology. You're more likely to answer surveys if you're in a positive mood, stuff like that. So external validity is something we need to really take into consideration, and there's a lot of things that can challenge this. How about the 8th learning objective, which is analyze the statistical validity as it pertains to the research claims? We're going to look at this a little bit here, only a couple slides, and then we'll get to internal validity. As I said, this is more covered in stats, but this is something to consider. That is, statistical validity refers to whether the statistical conclusions are appropriate and reasonable. If you say something like for a frequency or descriptive claim, estimates should be accompanied by a margin of error. If I say 44% of Americans are unhappy, if I just say that, that's a little bit disingenuous. That is not good statistics, because, as you know from statistics, you need both a measure of central tendency, which is what this 44% is, and a measure of variability showing how spread out the data is. But not just how spread out the data is, but within that spread is going to then, you're going to use probability with that spread of data to figure out what a margin of error. Because that 44%, that's a good number, but the point is that the actual mean is likely not to be 44%. Again, stats talks about that when you're talking about sampling distributions of the mean, things like that. So here we would add in a margin of error. So the margin of error is plus or minus 3%. So 44% plus or minus 3% of Americans are unhappy. And that's where you start to take in statistical control. And statistical control can then add in controls that are not there otherwise. For margin of error are smaller when the sample size is larger. So this, as our sample size becomes larger, this becomes smaller. If you sample a whole population, your margin of error essentially becomes 0. We can't typically measure that though. So that is for frequency claims. For association and causal claims, the key consideration is the strength of the association. So if we say that the correlation between midterm and final grades is 0.32, that's a correlation of 0.32. That's a modest correlation. It's not that strong of a correlation. But the correlation between students' height and their foot size is 0.73. That is a strong correlation. So the stronger the correlation, the higher the statistical validity. The stronger the relationship. And that even works in causal claims. The stronger the relationship, the stronger the statistical validity. And that's, again, something more covered in stats, but it is important to hear. So looking at that a little bit deeper, for association causal claims, another consideration is the uncertainty of the inferential claims. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if you've got the correlation between midterm and final grades with a p of 0.03, we still have to take into consideration this. P of 0.03 means there's a 3% chance. And again, this is something talked about in stats, what p-values is. But what this basically means is there's a 3% chance that a type 1 error was committed, meaning there was a false positive. So that's something that needs to be considered when you're looking at statistical validity. Another thing is the opposite side. So let's say the difference in consumption between two conditions was not significant with a p of 0.09. This means there's a 9% chance of type 1 error. And because of this, because it is greater than 5%, we are going to fail to reject the null. What does that mean? Because we're failing to reject the null, we're saying there is no effect. We have a limit of committing a type 1 error of 5%. So that 5% is our limit. Because there's a 9% here that's greater than our limit, that means we're going to conclude that there is no relationship between these two variables. However, there could be a difference between those two variables, so we could be committing a type 2 error, which is a false negative. We could be saying there's no effect when there actually is effect. So these are two things that need to be considered, and then the power of your statistics as well, which is again something talked about in stats. This gets us to our final learning objective, that is to analyze the internal validity as it pertains to the research claims. So again, recall those three conditions of supporting a causal claim. First, that there's covariance. Second, that there's temporal precedence. The two variables are related and variable A comes before variable variable B, and then finally that no other variable can account for the association between A and B, also called internal validity. That's what internal validity is. Internal validity is basically checking to make sure that there is no other explanation, there's no other variable that can account for the association between A and B. Weak internal validity means that there's other variables that could possibly be responsible for that association. High internal validity means there's no associations. So again, internal validity is factors in research study that raise doubts. Threats to internal validity are factors in research that raise doubts or questions about the interpretation of the results. So a threat to internal validity is any factor that allows an alternate explanation for the results. This is also called a confounding variable. So a confounding variable is going to be any variable that causes doubt in the explanation of the relationship between the two variables. Now, I explained how, let's say you've got two groups that are taking drug A and drug B. You randomly assign people to groups. Or let's say you don't randomly assign people to groups. Let's say you've only got drug A on one day and you've only got drug B on another day. So on the first day you assign people to drug A. On the second day you assign people to drug B. Well, now you've just introduced confounding variables. It could be the day that the test was done. It could be that one test was done on a Friday where everyone is already feeling good because it's the end of the week. The other test was done on a Monday. It's the beginning of the week. People aren't happy, so it could result in differences in pain levels. So you've introduced a confounding variable. What we do to account for that is random assignment. I just got done saying we assign people to groups based on the day they came in rather than randomly. Well, if we assign people randomly, if we assigned half the people to get drug A, half the people to get drug B, we are then basically making the groups statistically equivalent. The groups are not actually equivalent, but they're as close to equivalent as we can get because we randomly assign people to the two groups. It could be that you get a lot of people in group A that are more tolerant to pain than group B, but by randomly assigning it, you're accounting for that via probability. And that is where that chance of type 1 error we were talking about, the p-values and alpha we were talking about on the previous slide come in, because that is how we statistically account for even the chance that everyone that would be affected by one treatment ended in one group, even with random assignment. So probability is still something of concern. But because the groups are equivalent, there should not be any reason for the groups to differ in their behavior except for the experimental manipulation. So there should not be confounding variables. There should be internal validity. Let's look at an example here. Schallenberg published an article entitled Music Lessons Enhance IQ. The article here is making a strong causal claim as indicated by the verb enhance. Music lessons enhance. So it's right there in the title of the article, they're making a causal claim. They're not saying that its music lessons are related to IQ. They're saying music lessons enhance. Music lessons cause an increase in IQ. The causal claim is reasonable because he randomly assigned 6-year-old children to two different types of music lessons, keyboard or voice, or to a control group that received drama lessons or no lessons. So different control groups. IQ then was measured before and after the lessons, and those in the music groups showed larger increases in IQ than those in the control conditions. Here, the study didn't just show that children who take music lessons have greater IQ, which would only support the association claim, wouldn't support causal, because having music lessons, even if the temporal precedence is fulfilled, you still have the problem of it could be just those who have higher IQ are taking music lessons. By randomly assigning children to groups, the study ensured that the children who took the music lessons weren't different statistically than other children. These children weren't smarter, grittier, or wealthier, so the study eliminated those confounds and increased internal validity. Which gets us back to internal validity with association claims. The thing here is, since internal validity is mostly relevant for causal claims, it's not really relevant for association claims because you can't control everything. However, in quasi-experimental research, as we already said, that's a type of association claim where you are attempting to control for as many third variables as possible. So by doing that, you're achieving internal validity, at least to an extent. You might be achieving limited internal validity. Because again, let's say we were trying to see if pregnancy causes changes in cognition. Well, you can look at those who are pregnant and those who are not pregnant, but it could still be something else that caused that. But as long as you've got temporal precedence and you are controlling for as many variables as possible. So a way to control for as many variables as possible is to do a matched pairs design, where you match people. You've got people in each of the groups, let's say the pregnant and not pregnant, you match them on as many characteristics as you can. So you have one person in the pregnancy condition and one in the not, that are matched on as much as you can. Age, temperament, all of these different wealth, all of these different types of things. And then it's a lot of work, but then you can, through an association claim, get internal validity and start to show cause. So again, the goal of any research study is to maximize both internal and external validity. Even correlational research, you want to maximize as much as you can internal and external validity. However, there is a balancing act that needs to be done, because trade-offs are present. There's the problem. That is, increasing internal validity by default is going to reduce external validity. If you put some people in a sterile environment where everything is controlled for, you've put them in such an artificial environment that you've weakened the generalizability of your results. You've weakened the external validity of your results. So the purpose of or goals of a study then is truly, in essence, to help you decide which type of validity is more important and which threats must be addressed. I'm a big person that loves my observational research, and my observational research is where I'm basically making a decision to reduce some of the internal validity to, in a sense, increase external validity. But I still have to keep those into consideration, and I still have to control as much as I can. That's why I actually like the pseudo lab, where you've got a lab setting that is as real as possible to the reality, to the non-lab setting, to the environment someone would be in when they're actually expressing those behaviors. Create that so that they're more likely to act in a natural way, so the results are more generalizable. That's why I said with my experiment, with my study, I brought people in the lab, but then I put them in what they thought was a waiting room. So they're not in what they believe to be a fully controlled environment. It's more of a natural environment. So looking at the implications to threats of internal validity, or threats to validity in as a whole, research studies vary in terms of validity. Never accept a research result or conclusion as true simply because it has been scientifically demonstrated. I just got done talking about, well, it could be a problem then of external validity. Or it could be that they didn't control for everything, so they do have problems with internal validity. Or it could have been that they used the wrong stats. So scientifically demonstrated doesn't mean anything if they use the wrong stats. So they could be lacking in statistical validity. But being aware of the threats can help you critically evaluate a research study, and then make your own decisions about a research report's validity and quality. Just because something's been published, even if it went through peer review, doesn't mean you should take it as true. Always question, when you're reading a research article, how valid is that study? How valid is it internally? Did they control for enough? How valid is it statistically? Did they use the right stats? And how valid is it externally? Did they make the right generalizations? Let's look at an example. So an example here. We've got early language skills reduce preschool tantrums, a study found. They use the word reduce. Again, reduce is a strong word in stats. Reduce means that there was a cause. The early language skills reduced, meaning they caused a reduction, a lessening in preschool tantrums. Not that early language skills were related to preschool tantrums or correlated with, that early language skills reduced preschool tantrums. So the journal was describing a new peer-reviewed research article where researchers studied children for several years. So it's a journalist. First thing first, it's a secondary source. It's not an academic source. It's a non-academic source because it was a journalist. So you should already call into question. You should go to the source and find out what's going on at the source. While going to the source, the children who had better language skills at 18 months did a better job coping with frustration, not being allowed to open a gift for 8 minutes when they were 4 years old. So this asks the question, why is the headline misleading? What should the headline have said? Did they manipulate language skills? If they didn't manipulate language skills, if there was no manipulation, we can already say this straight up. If there was no manipulation, then you cannot make a causal claim. They did not manipulate language skills. It looks like they just measured language skills at 18 months and then measured frustration at 4 years old, and temporal precedence is there. 18 months is before 4 years old, but there was no manipulation. Because there was no manipulation, the article is misleading. There's no cause. You cannot make a causal claim. Instead, it should have said early language skill is related to preschool tantrums. Those, or you could say those with better early language skills tend to have fewer preschool tantrums, because tend to have means relation. So the headline's misleading because reduce indicates a causal claim, but the study design is not experimental. Yes, the measurement of language skills came before 4 years old, so there is temporal precedence. However, there was no experimental manipulation, therefore there could have been confounding variables. Therefore, there is no internal validity. Perhaps children with higher IQs usually have better language skills, thus are better at coping with their frustration. Perhaps parents are more supportive. Some parents are more supportive than others, and supportive parents could cause their children to develop both linguistic skills and better coping skills. There is too many possible confounds. So a better headline would be early language skills predict. So predict is a good word there. Better ability to control anger. Or early language skills now means fewer tantrums later. Early language skills now means fewer tantrums later. It's getting closer to causal in those wordings, but it's still not doing causal. Let's look at a whole bunch of claims here. And these claims, there's a lot of them. And you can look at these and look at their wording and figure out what type of claim is being made, frequency, association, or causal. Like the first one, worry may make women's brains work overtime. They're trying to make a causal claim there, but they're saying the may, so it's not necessarily the case. Pet ownership sourcebook reports that 38% of U.S. households own a dog. Frequency claim, easy to say there. Smiling may lower, so again, may have a cause. Just looking through these, you can look to see which ones are causal. So this is your chance to practice looking at these and figuring out which ones are frequency, which ones are association, which ones are causal. And you should look at this based on logic. What can and can't be manipulated? Do you think the study could have actually supported its claim? Maybe a journalist was misrepresenting something. Those with ADHD do 1 month's less work a year. If it's trying to make a causal claim, it can't, because you can't assign people to have ADHD or not. And do you think these concepts could be measured or manipulated? Or how do you think they could be? What practical, ethical, or financial issues would be relevant? So these are ones just to look through. Look through these claims that journalists are making and try to see if they're actually frequency, association, or causal. This gets us to our final point. So that is some questions. Some questions that may be good things to know. Maybe these are types of questions that would be on an exam. Which validity is appropriate to interrogate in every study? Of those 4 validities, you've got construct validity, you've got internal validity, external validity, and statistical validity. Which one is appropriate to interrogate in every single study you do? If you said construct validity, you are correct. Construct validity is the most important validity to be interrogated in every single study, because it's the validity that you can't even run a study without. The other validities are still important, but you can't even do a study without proper construct validity. Which validities are not always relevant for a study? Think about that for a minute. Which validity or validities are not always relevant for a study? Well, if you said internal, you're correct, because internal is usually only relevant for causal studies. If you've got an uncorrelational study, internal validity isn't as important. If you've got just a descriptive, then or a frequency claim, then internal validity doesn't really matter. Why can't researchers achieve all 4 validities in a single study? It's impossible to achieve perfect validity in all 4 validities. Why? Because there's trade-offs. Some validities cause an increase in some validities, cause a decrease in other validities, which gets us to the next question: which 2 validities are the most often traded off? Well, we did just talk about this a few minutes ago, so you should already be able to you should be screaming out the answer right now, waking up your neighbors, because you should be screaming out that it's external and internal validity. Because external and internal validity, getting higher internal validity lowers your external validity. You've also got an issue, though, of external and construct validity. As you get better external validity, you're going to actually lower your construct validity, because as something becomes more generalizable, the definition of it has to get a little bit looser. As you get more and more specific with your definition of whatever your construct is, then that's going to make it harder and harder to generalize to other populations. And which validity is most under the researcher's control? We haven't said statistical yet, and I'm going to say that statistical would probably be a correct answer here, except one of the other ones is more under the researcher's control. What is that? That is internal validity, because internal validity by definition is control. So the more control the researcher has, the more control the researcher is implementing, the higher the internal validity.